Good morning. I'm Michael Johnson from the Church of the Advent, where our lead pastor is Dr. Y.D.B. Thurgood Jr. and leading lady missionary Nakisha Thurgood. And welcome to the Hour of Victory Sunday School. Thank you for taking time out to watch us on our social media platforms. Now, if this is your first time here or you're a long-time supporter, go ahead for me and like, share, and subscribe. Today is January 8, 2023, and the title of our lesson is Proclaiming Christ. The Bible truth states that Paul rejoiced in proclaiming the gospel even when he was in prison. Our memory verse is from Philippians chapter 1, verse 18, and it reads in the New King James Version, "What then? Notwithstanding, every way, whether in the pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." Before I read the Bible basic, I would recommend you read the following scriptures. Psalm chapter 119, verses 169 through 176, Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, Colossians chapter 1, verses 21 through 29, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and Philippians chapter 1, verses 1 through 26, and incorporate the insights gained into your study of this lesson. Onto the Bible basic in King James Version, Philippians chapter 1, starting at verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached God Christ of contentions, not necessarily supposed to add afflictions to my bond, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then? Notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. For I know that this shall turn into my salvation through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and my hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in this flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I would not. For I am straight betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. Chapter 1 starts a brief introduction, followed by three key sections. First, Paul gives thanks and prayers on behalf of the Philippian Christians. Secondly, he focused on the expansion of the gospel. Third, he emphasized that for believers, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, along the way, Paul explains how a Christian life is a reflection of what they've set their mind on. He stresses the importance of rejoicing and joy and connects the faith to concepts such as glory. Paul is certainly interested in thanking the church of Philippi for their generous support. At the same time, he is concerned about the negative influence, including false teachers and arrogance within the church itself. The introduction named Paul and Timothy as an author. It defines his audience and it adds a brief greeting. Now, the audience is the Philippian Christians. Specifically mentioned are the overseers and deacons as well. 1 Timothy chapter 3 is the only other New Testament reference specifically mentioned deacons in Ephesus. The Philippian church had existed for approximately 12 years before this letter was written. In those years, the members had matured in learning and in leadership. Now, Philippians chapter 1, verse 3 through 11 begins with Paul thanking God for the Philippians in his prayer. He mentioned their long-term partnership in his calling. He mentioned his imprisonment and the ministry and missing the believers. He also encouraged them to grow in love for one another. Just as the Apostle John emphasized in his letter, Paul used this section to stress the importance of Christians to love in the life of believers. Now, Philippians chapter 1 verse 12 through 18, shares how Paul's imprisonment and helping spread the gospel. All of the guards knew about his faith, so Paul was clearly willing to preach to his own captors. Now, as a result, other believers grew in boldness to speak about Christ. Now, interestingly, Paul notes that some of those who spoke about Jesus did so for false motive. Paul knew that some preachers, because they wanted to surpass Paul in his ministry and promote their own name and be placed higher than Paul. These people were glad Paul was in prison because they felt that this gave them a competitive edge over him, what they considered to be a contest of preaching the gospel. Now, their motive, at least in part, be a competitive spirit, was too often, it's a common thing among pastors. Paul wasn't so critical or cynical to believe that every other preacher had this bad motive. He knew that some also preached from goodwill. Now, ambition isn't necessarily bad. There's nothing wrong in wanting to be the best we can be for God. But selfish ambition is most concerned about the success of one's image instead of striving for the true success of God. Those who preach Christ for the wrong motive, supposed to add to the affliction of Paul's chains. Now, their competitive heart did not only want to win for themselves, they also wanted Paul to lose. So people preaching the gospel more energetically, motivated by Paul's imprisonment, some were motivated in a good way, and some were motivated in a bad way. Yet, nevertheless, they were motivated, and Paul could rejoice in that. Now remember, Paul's concern here was not the content of the gospel being preached, only the motive of those preaching it. Paul's objective, the thought of the false or distorted gospel was being preached, even if it was with the best motives. Now, Paul's attitude was like this: if you preach the true gospel, I don't care what your motives are. If your motives are bad, God will deal with you. But at least the gospel is being preached. But if you preach a false gospel, I don't care how good your motives are, you are dangerous and must stop preaching your false gospel, and good motives doesn't excuse your false message. Now, Paul's imprisonment could not hinder the gospel, neither could the wrong motive of some. God's work will still get done, and that's the cause of rejoicing. Join us next week. Our lesson is Jesus' humility and exaltation. Our Bible basis is from Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. We will analyze Paul's description of God's exaltation of Jesus based on sacrifice and selflessness rather than power. We will value selfless behavior rather than power, and we will adopt a Christ-like humility as our personal lifestyle. I want to thank you for your faithful support and inviting us into your home week after week. And I want to remind you to join us tonight at 7 p.m. for our Sunday night service. God bless you and have a blessed day.